The story of Genesis is an inversion of the prior age's cultural symbols. Goddess-worshipping and polytheistic cultures preceded all of our earliest histories, each of whose godhead was the queen of heaven. Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, Hathor, Eve, Demeter, Delphine, Ariadne. As we first began to people the heavens and earth with supernatural forces, the creative force would have been conceived of as a feminine principle. There wouldn't be much reason for apes or the first humans to comprehend male's part in the life cycle. This queen often took the form or forms of a trinity called the Three-in-One, popularly known later as the Maiden Mother Crone, a shapeshifter who represents the stages of life, time, change, and rebirth. In her form as the goddess of wisdom or knowledge, she was often a serpent, bee, scorpion, or other creature that stung or bit the unwise. She was heavily associated with trees, though the tree itself was often her male consort, the horned god or green man, a demigod of vegetation, the wild, and death, half human, both her husband and her son at either end of the mythical cycle, the son being the father, reborn. Rather than an original story set in opposition to Ishtar or Inanna cults, or one which merely appropriated symbolism from such a cult, Genesis is more likely an inversion of a parallel feminine creation myth from the earlier Canaanite, Sumerian, and Egyptian beliefs, all cobbled together and contradicted. Eve's true name is Hava or Hawa, HWH. One letter, the IYJ, at the time the same letter, away from the Tetragrammaton. The name means creation or life. It is current consensus that Judaism begins not monotheistic, but with a divine couple, Yahweh and Asherah. But before they were gods, we deified ancestors from ghosts to guardians, eventually into pantheons, and there is ample evidence to suggest Eve, a mortal first woman, was worshipped as the great mother or first ancestor, as earth and queen of heaven, and whose act of creation was far more visceral than waving a hand or saying a word. Goddesses were associated with trees, took serpentine or dragon forms when representing wisdom or knowledge, retrieved fruit as a form of learning about creation, and the flashing of genitalia, particularly menstrual genitalia, an action called anasema, was a method of eliciting frivolity and laughter, but also of warding off evil, particularly in the forms of male violence and storms. We find the practice of scaring off hailstorms and male attackers by flashing genitals a common practice in Ireland, the Balkans, Greece, and across Africa. Menstruating genitals likely scared off rapists, and the practice was extrapolated to be used against male storm and sky gods who are historically not fans of consent or boundary. So a story where we are kicked out of a garden because the first woman spoke with a serpent on a tree and ate the fruit of wisdom, where we realize we are naked and so cover up, and menstruation and childbirth are a punishment by a male god, is too many inversions to be coincidental. So we return to our friend, Conan the Scandinavian. In an almost verbatim reenactment of the telephone game mechanic, barbarians, through Conan, transform in stages of adaptation from Berbers, blue-eyed, dark-skinned people with black hair, into Scandinavian mountain shepherds who worship steel, i.e. Kurgans. Thulsa Doom goes from Skeletor-esque sorcerer and leader of a death cult to a dark-skinned androgynous man with blue eyes who worships serpents, i.e. a Berber. Did Jean Milius or the producers intentionally do this? I don't think so. I think they cast Conan in a way that would sell in Reagan's America, altered the text to mirror biblical motifs to enhance its sense of epic resonance to themselves and to 80s Western audiences, raised in a Christian realism, eyes that fear the dark and racial contradictions and covet Nordic features. But regardless of intent or awareness, these are all still inversion tropes. Inversion tropes are when a cult preemptively accuses the enemy of their own techniques, such as in calling those outside the cult brainwashed or claiming they are victims of violence by redefining violence as a precursor to enacting it, the real kind, or claim you are being scapegoated and then point out a scapegoat. It's the weaponization of turnabout as fair play, a concept more intrinsic to conservative identity. Retribution, revenge, and who can play at that game are all obviously reactionary, after all. Modern retellings, reimaginings, remakes, and reboots all seek to transform old stories to tell a modern, diverse culture's story. But cross-casting, racial recasting, and inversions of story tropes are inversions of inversions. Overly corporate markets don't like risk, so they return to old IPs again and again to tell a modern story when is forced to hijack the past. This upsets people who feel like their past is being revised in the same way a fascist agenda reinvents history, and they're right. But remember, a reactionary thinks this gives him license to return the favor. In addition, like Tolkien, these adaptations accept the underlying premise and core metaphors of the previous version of the text and invert only identities. People raised by Protestant reality, by post-World War II propaganda, by white European reality, in other words, by Disney, can only create cognitive dissonance by changing part of what a symbol does, but not all, or worse, intensify the bad message beneath it all. Making Eve black, for instance, intends to acknowledge black people in the origins of the world, but if she is still Eve, you alter the message to punish black women instead of white for being women. This is reformation, revisionism for the sake of defeating revisionism. Can we undo inversion instead? Revert the symbols to their original meanings? To do that, we must know the original meanings of the story, symbolically, allegorically, historically, psychologically, sexually, and experientially. Let's try. The story would have to be almost as archetypical as the garden, simple to the point of a fairy tale, but incoherent somehow as to indicate there may have been some inversion going on. What about the very next chapter of the Bible, Cain and Abel? Something's bothered me about that since grade school. Why would God reject vegetables so harshly, but praise the animal sacrifice? Why is the butcher shown to be a gentle, innocent shepherd and the gardener a jealous, homicidal maniac? It's often interpreted as the agriculture and artisan slaughtering the hunter-gatherer, ushering in the new era of humanity. That sounds a lot like the era of progress to me, and ignores that agriculture is current with hunting and gathering, not after it. Like Conan in Genesis, could it be an inversion? Let's reverse its tropes and see if it makes more sense or falls apart. In the traditional story of Cain and Abel, Cain, a gardener, is rejected by God in favor of his shepherd brother. In a fit of jealousy, Cain slays Abel. In retaliation, God curses Cain to walk the earth and have nothing grow beneath his feet. Well, we already know by now that shepherds are far from the gentle, altruistic caretakers of men we have been raised to view them as. We also know goddess cultures in the archaic existed in the plains, eating a mostly vegetarian diet. The stationary mountain cultures that slaughtered and subjugated the nomadic vegetarian goddess cultures worshipped the sun, volcanoes, mountains, steel, and were carnivorous. Ancient cultures did not have names descended from ancient languages. Their languages were those ancient languages, so their names were words, phrases, and compound words in their own language. So when an archaic poet named a character, they could not help but give them a name that had obvious connotations. Cain means to acquire and gift, but also create. Fitting name for a child, for a gift from God, for the plants of the earth, for a gardener when plants are God's gifts, and for the son of Hawa, goddess of life and earth. Havel, on the other hand, means empty, stupidity, absurdity, useless, and breath, but not in the life or spirit way of a word like ruach, but an empty, fleeting wind. In other words, vain, as in useless, meaningless, self-serving, or by mistake. Etymological dissonance like this is usually hand-waved away by assuming the alienness of the authoring culture. The presumption is Havel is referring to the boy's life as being a waste, and sure, but that feels like a stretch or apologetics in some way. In truth, Havel's definitions sound suspiciously like definitions of the word evil, particularly in a language where of use is synonymous with good, as it is in the first creation story in this same book. When the Elohim create something and see it as good, the actual word is that it works or is of use. In fact, Abel's name, Havel's actual pronunciation and spelling look awfully cognate with every other root of the word evil, and certainly fit them better than the current theoretical Proto-Indo-European upelos, to go beyond. More importantly than all this midrash, if we switch the brothers, the story ceases to be a fantastical event without a moral other than to say animal sacrifice good, vegetables bad, and becomes a coherent fable. A boy named Vanity kills one of the animals of the world under human guardianship. He brings it as an offering, but God, having instructed humans to care for creatures of the earth, rejects it. Vanity's brother, Gift, brings fruits and vegetables from his garden, which aligns with humanity's contract with God. Then Havel, the being who has just invented murder, a being whose name implies he is useless and empty inside, does the same thing to his brother. His punishment is that nothing will grow under his feet. He cannot garden. While this is a poetic punishment for a gardener like Cain, it is more consistent in an allegory where gardening is the point of humanity, e.g. tending to the planet, and life is the ultimate power and reward. All this is nice speculation, but is it likely? Quite. We can already demonstrate that Eden is an inversion from the story's predecessor, the story of Ishtar, goddess of love, the most worshipped single deity in the world, before monolatry of the Skyfather took the world by storm. In Ishtar's catabasis, she descends into the underworld to retrieve the fruit of carnal knowledge and return with the secret of life. Her journey is the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's monomyth, the arc of every dying and returning hero and god, thus of the journey of the sun through the heavens, but also of a mystery initiate's vision quest, every sleeper's dreaming, every girl discovering her own nether regions and becoming a woman, and the mythological explanation of womankind retrieving the secret to creating life from the land of the dead, something that to a primitive post-ape would have been women's exclusive domain. What about the other catabases from other cultures? If ancient Egypt's Osiris myth was originally the Isis myth, and Isis the first queen and avatar of Ra, the sun god, then we cease to have a nonsensical mythological cycle and suddenly are presented with a coherent folktale about the cycle of the day, where Isis Re is dismembered into the stars and moon, and pieced back together by her husband, the black god, the night sky, and is reborn as the dawn sun the next day. Isis's real name is Ast, and Ra's real pronunciation Re or Rhea, and so her real name, if she were the sun, would be Astrea. Ishtar's other names, Astarte, Ashtoreth, Oestra, Esther, Easter, and Asherah. But a period where Isis Ra was worshipped would be very old indeed, since we have no living records of it in ancient Egypt. But then we're talking about pre-dynastic times anyway. We're talking about the origins of the species. If we know feminine serpent cultures were wiped out and replaced with patriarchal sun cults, then the story of Apollo slaying a python to claim the Delphic oracle as his own ceases to be a fictional myth and becomes a mythical retelling of the actual history, narrating the imperial force personified as their deity Apollo, whose name means destroyer, eradicates the serpent cult in the form of their dragon, and enslaves the serpent priestesses that guarded the Omphalos, the navel of the world, a pit of ethylene fumes purported to give them visions of the future. Pythia, the name of the head oracle, speaker for the deep, is said to derive from the stench of the serpent's rotting corpse. But what if it was originally the natural hallucinogenic fumes of the cave and thus the living serpent's breath? Prior to being Python, a man-eating male serpent, the dragon at Delphi was Delphine, a female, both from a word for womb. And how did the destroyer treat his oracles? Most of the stories of Apollo with the priestess of what is allegedly his domain, divination, are of him tricking or punishing them. It's become a trope, even into today's time travel fiction, that knowing the future makes one helpless to prevent it. Apollo's most famous story with an oracle being that of Cassandra, whom he cursed to see the future, but for no one to believe. This seems like the opposite of a god of oracles, wouldn't you say? It seems like a god who hates them, one who conquers them and continuously demonstrates his dominance over them. And what of the Titans, of all the Astro and Aster gods and words, and the Titan Rhea of ancient Greece, who we now know shares the name of Egypt's sun? The primary catabasis myth of ancient Greece would be the Persephone myth. If Persephone births a male, as she does in the androgynous Dionysus, there is no cycle related to the natural cycles at all. But if Persephone instead gives birth to a girl, then the triple goddess is whole, and the cycle eternally repeats by ending where it began. The Kori, or maiden, Persephone's other epithet, is impregnated and at the moment of birth becomes the mother. At that same moment, Demeter, whose name means Earth Mother, becomes the crone or mistress. Hecate, the mistress or despoina, who guides the mother into the underworld to retrieve her daughter, does not return from the underworld but stays as the moon and also as the unborn maiden of the next cycle. The Kori becomes the Demeter becomes the despoina becomes the Kori. A reenactment of this live birth was almost certainly at the center of the Eleusinian mysteries, but we'll get to those in another video. Kori, Demeter, and Despoina are titles. Persephone, Gaia, and Hecate are all likely names, although several others like Athena or Artemis could have also held those ranks at other points in time or locations in Hellene. And since all the characters are accounted for, what was the newborn's name? By the classical period, it is Dionysus that was said to be born of Hades and Persephone's nuptials. Dionysus was a newer addition to the Olympians, who replaced Hestia, goddess of the hearth and perpetual maiden, on whom Vesta and the Vestal Virgins were based. Her real spelling is Estia, the starting H, an artifact of Greek dialects' hard breathing before initial vowels. Think of how Spanish speakers add a vowel to words that begin with consonants. Start the engines, right? It's the opposite of that. Estia may as well be Easter, Astarte, etc., with one difference, Yah instead of Ra. Ra was the sun of Egypt and Yah was the moon, but also the name of the baby in Eleusis. Dionysus' Eleusinian ritual name was Iacchus. When Est becomes the sun, she will be Est Rhea or Astrea, but she never got to be because the male gods intervened in the cycle. As the moon, Estia, Hestia, as a Greek would pronounce it. The moon and stars, like hearths in the sky, and the hearth, verifiably the first temple in archaic Greece. If you line up hearth temples to Hestia beneath formations in the stars, you would be able to use the sky like a map. A nomadic gatherer people would be especially helped by this, and with them, sailors and travelers in the desert descended from them. Elyon, the Most High, was a combination of El and On, gods of the day and night, forming the divine couple as one being the Lord of the gods, or Lord God. If we made a Most High style name from the combination of the Egyptian sun and moon, a name to refer to all of the goddesses' forms, we might get Asteria or Asteria. All of these names remained in use as nymphs, goddesses, and titans by the classical period. The original maiden mother mistress was perhaps Astrea, Hestia, Asteria. Even older on Crete we find Ariadne, whose name means most holy or most pure, who descends into the underground labyrinth to meet the Minotaur, a cannibal man-bull. The labyrinth, named such after the images of the laborious or double-sided axe found at the site, is a vaginal phallic symbol like a chalice, rose, a mouth, or a portal, and its site associated with a Gaellanic culture. A cognate-type relation to the Latin labium for lips, from which we derive labia, is not unlikely. The axe, meanwhile, a tool for cutting trees, and its double sides are probably a visual pun of sorts, another symbol of the feminine harkening back to the Shila Nagig, statues of females exposing their genitals and spreading their vulva to ward off evil. The bull was the consort, child, and servant of the celestial cow goddess during the Gaellanic Age. If the story of the labyrinth and Minotaur is inversion, then the bull is not a man-eater, but another phallic symbol, the horned god, the penis, but also the clitoris, the same as the tree of carnal knowledge. The mysteries are as much sexual and its predecessor masturbatory ecstasy as they are hallucinatory ecstatic communion with deity. But it is that too, of course, an alchemical wedding of the soul to the goddess, and the wedding night where the god of death and sex takes our maidenhead and impregnates us with gnosis, the divine knowledge of reality, life, and creation, for us to return and birth the world. Ariadne on Minoan Crete was worshipped at the festival of Anthesteria. Her wedding night with Dionysus, a horned god of wine associated with satyrs, goats, and bulls, where the dead walked the earth. He was thought to be the god Hades, his father in the Persephone myth, born on earth, although sometimes he is Zeus's child. Hades was, in the end, the chthonic Zeus, or night sky. So if Dionysos, god of Nisos, or the procreative urge, is the Minotaur, then Dionysus's real name is the Minotaur's real name, Asterion. We find a feminine form of his name in the name of the festival, Anthesteria, dedicated to, or the placement of, Asteria. The name is also emergent in words like hysteria, a supposed madness induced from the feminine cycle, from the Greek ousterios, where oustera is the ancient Greek for womb, synonymous with Delphoi. Madness from the wine of the god of madness, her husband, perhaps. Meanwhile, istor is where we derive the word history. Hister allegedly meant judge, witness, or wise person. Finally, in Genesis, prior to a man's creation, we find the hybrid god couple the Elohim had prior to man created and annihilated a race of dragons almost as strong as the Elohim themselves, called Leviathans. Atana was the Minoan serpent goddess that would become Athena. Levi means priest. Levi Athena. This will be disregarded because there's no cultural connection between the Jews and the ancient Greeks. Right? More on that in another video. The serpent priestesses, masters of their bodily cycles, and thus the months, and thus the days, and thus the stars, the same word as Easter, Aster, Hestia, and thus time itself, would have been the keepers of history as well, like a long-term memory. So you see, there's no need for the term herstory. History is already the name of the goddess. Think of mythological archetypes at the end of the day as thought-compressing cliches, like zip files for all your experiences with a particular concept. When they are used in good faith, they recall tons of information compressed into a feeling or an emotion. Stories are like linguistic mathematical proofs, archetypes, the geometric shapes we use to recall the past, to discover solutions to concrete problems now, and to predict the future. When they are inverted, they cause the kind of cognitive dissonance and memory problems that cults like New Prescription use as fuel. When they combine with jargon that does not fit the real definition as used by people to communicate, let's say we all know red means revolutionary and blue reactionary, but you switch them at the moment of a great trauma, should we be surprised that so-called liberal college kids begin defending their beliefs in a dogmatic, puritanical way, becoming a cathedral? And that Christian America becomes revolutionary, self-expressed through boundary-pushing humor, and lacking in all belief or faith. In such a topsy-turvy world, no one can talk to one another. Everyone is alienated and inverting tropes without even noticing, and constantly ending conversations with thought-terminating cliches, because everyone is in a cult of their own devising, and there are no leftists anymore. But I have good news. The sun is a woman. 4 women, in point of fact, who are the same woman, eternally giving birth to herself, nursemaiding herself, guiding herself to the end, and being born. The morning, midday, and evening suns, and the moon. You are your brother's keeper, and keeper of the garden earth, the first ancestor. Knowledge was not the first sin, but shame, and serpents only punish the foolish. Trust me, I can see the future.
We are gods, oh, we are gods. We're as gods, we are as